Should you need to read sheet music to get into music school? Last month, there was a bit of discourse on the subject that started with a tweet from Dr. Annika Sokolovsky. Music schools love to deny admission to folks who can't read music. This is an obscene form of gatekeeping. It's the type of thing that, if necessary for coursework, can be easily achieved with a few tutoring sessions and should not prevent anyone from being accepted. Now, of course, there was a lot of pushback on this idea to remove reading requirements, which echoed news stories from a couple of years ago where there were rumors that Oxford was going to remove its sheet music requirements for its music program. These rumors turned out to be completely false, by the way, but it did end up being the culture war clickbait of the day. My interpretation of Dr. Sokolovsky's tweet is that there are objectively amazing musicians who do not read sheet music, and by removing sheet music requirements to university, we give more equitable access to the elite education that universities provide. I like the idea behind this sentiment for sure, but I think there's a lot of nuance that needs to be addressed here when we talk about reading and music and what it even means to go to music school. So let's get into it. This video was brought to you by GiveWell, an organization that makes sure that your charitable donations have the most impact. More at the end of the video. Part 1. Reading is actually kind of hard. In this discussion, there were several academics that suggested that reading was in fact very easy and could be taught in an afternoon. There really isn't that much to the basic rules of reading music. What notes go where, what a time signature is, what a half note is versus a whole note, what a minim is next to a crotchet? Is that what they're called? Anyway, yeah, all this stuff really could be learned with an afternoon spent on YouTube going through YouTube videos. But if it were truly this easy, why is this then an obscene form of gatekeeping? You could just, learn the basics in an afternoon and then go to your audition and you'd be fine. And of course, the reason is that there's a massive difference between learning the basic mechanics of a system, a board game, a musical notation style, etc., and then mastery of that system. Learning how the chess pieces move is very simple. Mastering chess and all of the pattern matching that goes alongside that takes a lot longer. When I first showed up with my bass to jazz band freshman year of high school, I already knew the basics of reading bass clef because I had previously studied piano. I knew like all cows eat grass, I knew time signatures, etc. All that stuff I had in the bag. However, when Miss Racky started to count off on the first tune, I had to figure out where F sharp was on my bass. By the time I found it, we were already 8 measures in. And this is because I could read sheet music, but I hadn't yet developed a kinesthetic response to the information before me, the specific micro movements my limbs and my fingers needed to make in response to the notes on the page. I also hadn't yet developed an audiation response to the music. By looking at the notation, I didn't know yet what it was supposed to sound like. This skill is essential for sight reading and takes quite a bit of time and ear training to develop in young musicians. It's how experienced musicians can just read a score and know what it sounds like. So thinking about reading requirements and high school jazz band, there's quite a big gulf between knowing that this is an A and then being able to sight read this, knowing that the knight moves like this, and playing bullet chess with a grandmaster. And that gulf is not based on how much technical knowledge you've acquired, but how much kinesthetic response you've developed and how much audiation you've developed. This is why if you're a guitarist who learned through tablature, learning sheet music can feel like such a slog because the technical mastery of your instrument is tied to a different notational scheme, and switching to a new notational scheme essentially requires you to learn from scratch. Classical musicians who play instruments like violin or piano generally learn the technical aspects of their instrument through musical notation, so there's less of a disconnect there. So how do you bridge that gap for people who learned music in a different way besides musical notation, maybe tab, maybe learning by ear, but you still want them to go to music school? One response to this is that remedial classes should be offered, taught by student TAs that get people up to speed, matching their technical facility to notation. This is something that I actually have personal experience with. When I was at the Berklee College of Music, there was this class called Writing Skills that everybody either had to take or pass out of that covered all of the fundamentals of reading and writing music. And I worked as a student tutor with the people who needed the most help in that particular class. This was honestly a very frustrating experience for me because many of the students that I worked with had no prior music educational experience, and it was kind of like being put on me to address systemic inequities in music education, which as a 20-year-old music student just was not It was not fair. And so a lot of the students that I worked with, they continued to struggle throughout their time at Berklee. Not all of them, by the way, some of them really flourished, but like a significant portion of them did. You know, university music educations, like at their very core, are built on classical and jazz ecosystems that are deeply tied to proficiency in reading sheet music. Ear training classes require musical notation. Theory classes require musical notation. Performance classes require musical notation. Like, imagine going into an orchestra class and then learning everything from recordings by ear, or the teacher is teaching you your parts by ear. That would be cool, but that's not very practical. It's also like such a radical departure from the performance practices of orchestras around the world. Like, orchestras read sheet music. Removing reading requirements for entrance into music schools, especially music schools which focus on classical music, which is a lot of them, to be honest, would require like a fundamental reimagining of the performance practices of classical music and of jazz music and of a lot of the styles which are studied at university. I'm not opposed to that, by the way. I think more people should be learning music by ear. But that does bring me to the next point. Part 2, reading as a professional tool. One of the common pushbacks to Dr. Salakovsky's tweet compared letting people who don't know how to read sheet music into music school to letting the illiterate study English literature. This is easily dismissed. To read books, you must know how to read books. To play music, you don't need to know how to read music. As the great pianist Errol Garner said, nobody can hear you read. And in fact, if your teacher tells you, I can hear you reading, that's usually a bad sign, right? That means that you're kind of disconnected from the music in a way. However, you know, I can't really deny it. Reading sheet music has been pretty important to my career. Like, there are many opportunities I wouldn't have had if I couldn't sight read. I don't have any cold data on any of this stuff, but I have plenty of case studies, in other words, my gig vlogs that I've been posting on YouTube for the past 7 years, that show what being a professional musician in New York City is like from my perspective. Looking through all of these working musician gigs, broadly, you could kind of categorize them 3 ways: reading gigs, artist gigs, and cover gigs. There are exceptions here, but that's kind of how I'm gonna organize them for this video. Reading gigs are like when I played in the house band for the Bit Awards, or whenever I play with the 8-Bit Big Band. In these situations, where there's lots of intricate arranged music to play on little rehearsal, I'll get a demo recording and sheet music several days ahead of time for study and practice. In theory, I could just memorize the music from the demo and show up at the gig having memorized everything, but I generally do not do that because that could lead to issues in the limited rehearsal that we have, like the band leader telling us to change something at a certain measure or to cut certain measures. For these pop, jazz, and theater gigs, notation is vital for the kind of workflow with ensembles on very limited rehearsal and lots of music. Then, of course, there are artist gigs where you're playing as a sideman in a band supporting an artist. In these situations, it's more expected you memorize the music because it looks better and you genuinely perform better. To be reading on a stage would be like to be watching a play where all of the actors are reading their scripts. There's kind of a disconnect there between the audience and then the musicians on the stage. So for the theater of it all, for the sake of the performance, when I'm playing in my band or other bands, I try and memorize the music. Your mileage may vary. Different instruments can get away with having sheet music on stage, like string players, for example. Lucky bastards. But for artist gigs, you memorize the music. Cover gigs are ones where, you know, you're playing background music, party music for people in bars and restaurants. And I played a ton of weddings, and for those I had to memorize hundreds of top 40 rock, pop, and jazz songs. The set list was honestly quite daunting, and it was always changing depending what was on the radio. I started out these gigs with like a hodgepodge of piano vocal scores and lead sheets and transcriptions of the music that I'd written out, but I very quickly figured out that this was not the way to go. It was more practical just to memorize everything because these gig situations were often very chaotic. Song forms would just change randomly, like the singer would turn around and yell, "Cut the bridge!" Keys might need to be transposed depending on how the singer was feeling that day. Sometimes only half the band would know the song and I'd have to be yelling out chords to the guitarist. Sometimes I didn't know the song, so I'd have to be paying attention to the pianist's left hand pinky or the chord shapes on a guitar. Either from the front or the back, by the way. You can tell if something is a C or a G from the back of their hand, too. Anyway, if I didn't know a song, I'd sometimes just guess on what happened next based on my prior knowledge of pop song forms, and 80% of the time, you know, I'd guess right. And for that 20% where I didn't guess right, ooh, There are some spicy moments. Sometimes the bride or the groom would request a special song during a set, and then on our set break, we would go backstage, listen to that song on our phones, and then go play that song on the next set. So yeah, you know, the professional skills that I've developed across these three styles of working musician gigs are quite varied, and reading is certainly one of them, but it's not even close to being the most important. Consistently across my musical career, it's been my ear, my ability to improvise, my ability to adapt to different styles, and my musical memory which have served me the best in every professional situation. This is at a whole different level, but Patrick Bartley threw his 2 cents in on the matter, talking about his time playing on The Late Show. I was on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert for weeks at a time between 2016 and 2020 and looked at sheet music maybe twice ever. Most of the time, we didn't even have time to rehearse. John would play something in our ears and we'd have to catch it while Stephen was talking live. So if reading is like situationally important, why is it so emphasized in music school? Well, that brings me to part 3 of this little exploration.
Because reading is what?
Fundamental!
Part 3, what is music school even for? Okay, so I don't really have an answer to this one. I just thought that the reading discussion brought up some interesting questions about the purpose of music school in this capitalist society. And, you know, why not? If you need to read music to get into music school and to thrive in music school, is that because reading music, reading Western notation specifically, not like tablature or piano roll notation or Zhanpu, for example, which is very popular in music education in China, is it because Western music notation is a necessary prerequisite to working as a professional musician? Is music school a trade school that gives you the professional tools necessary to work? This is how a lot of music schools will market themselves, like, you know, Berkeley. But from what I see, this is really not what music school does. There's a big disconnect between what happened in my professional life and what happened at music school. This disconnect can be seen with how some professors reacted to Dr. Sokolovsky's tweet. Like this one saying that we need to read music in music school because how else will the concert pianist prepare for competitions? Which is a bit of a strange priority. First of all, why would all of higher education in music be geared towards the skills necessary for the vanishingly small amount of professional work for concert pianists that can be found in piano competitions? To put it bluntly, I'm an electric bass player. They don't allow many electric bass players in piano competitions. Yet. The reactionary pearl clutching at the idea of removing sheet music requirements at music school does not seem like it's for the benefit of working musicians. The West has fallen. I mean, come on. And if this is for the benefit of working musicians, it seems like it's for a subset of musicians that I'm not a part of and I feel like is very small. So if not trade school, what is music school? Well, I think music school is more of a cultural project that aims to maintain the aesthetic and musical practices like, you know, reading sheet music of a given musical style, mostly classical music and jazz music. The primary purpose is to train people in that style and the practices of that style, like reading notation, so that those students can go on to teach the next generation at university. In the classical world anyway, faculty almost always come from universities themselves, creating a feedback loop of musical practice. So it's really hard to change your approach to ear training, performance, and theory when your faculty has this deep relationship to Western music notation. If you want to get musicians who are great but don't read, you have to hire faculty whose pedagogy relies on things other than Western music notation as a matter of their musical practice. Like Irish traditional musicians, for example, or perhaps bluegrass or old-time musicians in the US. Any of that kind of like acoustic music tradition where there's a heavy emphasis on learning a wide variety of songs by ear and improvising in a specific stylistic language without the use of notation. By the way, definitely go check out Molly Tuttle. She's awesome. You could hire church or gospel musicians who grew up making music in the church, who likely can read music, but also just as likely can learn and teach music by ear. You could hire electronic music producers whose concepts of ear training, music, and production do not require Western music notation. These are just 3 musical traditions of many that you could incorporate if you're serious about reaching out to students who are amazing musicians, but maybe don't know how to read sheet music. A reasonable pushback to this is like, why would masters of these styles want to work at the university just to meet diversity quotas? I really don't have any answers here. It just goes to show you that reading is so deeply ingrained into how music is communicated, how we teach music, and how we communicate with each other about music. Short of nuking the entire system and then starting again, which I'm not exactly opposed to, by the way, you can't really address reading requirements without addressing many other things. I'll just say this. I don't regret ever having learned how to read music. I think it served me very well in my professional life, and I think it's very useful. And I'm glad that I put in the work when I did to learn how to read sheet music. And I think people are best served in music school having that experience of reading music, because the system as it exists right now rewards those who do have that ability. This video is brought to you by GiveWell, an organization that aims to identify and direct funding to charities that save or improve lives as much as possible. They have a rigorous approach modeling the cost effectiveness of charities to estimate which charities have the biggest impact. If you are planning on donating to a charitable organization this year, but you don't know where to start, I recommend going through GiveWell's website for yourself to see their reports on the different organizations they recommend based on how effective they are at saving and improving lives. Like Helen Keller International, for example, which provides technical assistance to vitamin A supplement programs in sub-Saharan Africa. It's actually very cool. You can go through in pretty excruciating detail on the website to see why they recommend the programs that they do. Like, it only costs $1 to deliver vitamin A supplements to a child. Supplemental programs have been proven to decrease vitamin A deficiency and also mortality rates. GiveWell does not take a cut of your donation and make sure that the money goes where it's needed most. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have up to $100 of your donation matched before the end of the year or as long as funds last. To claim this matching donation, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter Adam Neely at checkout. Make sure that they know that you heard about GiveWell from me to get your donation matched. And yes, I did just donate $100. I think that GiveWell is a great concept, and if it's something that you're interested in, I highly recommend it. Givewell.org. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Thanks everybody so much for watching. Click this playlist if you'd like to watch more YouTube videos about music theory, music history, and all of that jazz.
Peace.